Have you ever wondered what truly goes on behind a neighbor's closed doors? In 1873, in the quiet, rolling hills of Copeland County, the Morgan family farm was a picture of righteous American hard work. But behind the scent of fresh-cut hay and the sound of evening prayers, a different sound echoed, the faint, rhythmic clink of chains from the old barn. The Morgans were a family praised for their piety, for protecting their two daughters from the evils of the world. But what no one asked was what exactly they were being protected from. Now I want you to understand, this isn't a story about a single terrible crime that happened one night. This is about a horror that repeated itself every single day for 40 long years. While the world outside marched on, growing and changing, two young women were trapped in a darkness where time simply stopped. Their prison wasn't built by a stranger or a monster from a storybook. It was built, piece by piece, by the two people who were supposed to love them the most. Welcome to Shadow Stories. This is the place where we walk together into the darkness that history tried to forget. The story you are about to hear is a difficult one, and it will stay with you long after it's over. So I have to ask you directly, do you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of that barn? If the answer is yes, subscribe now and let me know in the comments where you're joining this investigation from. To truly understand how this happened, you have to picture the world as it was in 1873. Let's just take a moment and step back in time together. The Civil War was over, but its ghosts still haunted the landscape, especially in the quiet corners of the country like Copeland County. This was a place carved out of dense woods and rolling farmland, connected to the rest of the world only by a single dirt road and a weekly mail coach. News traveled slowly, and strangers were noticed instantly. Life here was governed by two things: the rhythm of the seasons and the word of the Bible. On the surface, there was a kind of harsh beauty to it all. Imagine the smell of coal smoke hanging in the crisp autumn air, the sound of an axe splitting wood, the sight of a lone horse and buggy making its way home at dusk. But beneath that peaceful surface, there was a different feeling. It was a feeling of order, yes, but a brittle kind of order. This was a community where privacy was sacred, but secrets were impossible. Every family's business was its own, and a man's home was his absolute kingdom, second only to God's. The church wasn't just a building you went to on Sundays. Its rules were the invisible fences that boxed everyone in, and in this world, asking too many questions about your neighbor was seen as a sign of bad character. It was this deep, ingrained culture of silence, this belief in looking away, that allowed a shadow to grow over the Morgan farm. People saw what they wanted to see: a good, hard-working family. They chose not to see the barn that was always locked, or the daughters who were never seen. And in that willful blindness, the perfect prison was built. So, let's talk about the architects of this private hell. Let's name them: Samuel and Elara Morgan. To you and me, if we lived next door, they would have been the very picture of respectability. Samuel was the kind of man whose presence filled a room. You'd see him in the fields from sunup to sundown, his shoulders broad and slightly stooped from a lifetime of labor. His hands were thick with calluses, hands that could fix a fence or soothe a nervous horse with equal skill. In church, his voice was the loudest during hymns, his prayers the most passionate. He was seen as a pillar of the community, a man of God, a man of unshakable principle. But I want you to look a little closer, past the image he so carefully maintained. There was a coldness in his eyes, a kind of unyielding certainty that was unnerving if you held his gaze for too long. When he spoke of protecting his daughters from the temptations of the world, his voice didn't hold warmth. It held the hard, unbending conviction of a jailer guarding his most precious prisoners. He wasn't protecting them for their future, he was protecting them from it. And Elara, she was the masterpiece of their deception. Quiet, always with a timid smile, she was the one the town ladies felt a little sorry for. They saw a woman overshadowed by a stern, domineering husband. They were dangerously wrong. Elara wasn't the victim in that house. She was the co-conspirator. Her silence wasn't fear, it was faith, a twisted, absolute faith in her husband's righteousness. While Samuel was the architect of their daughter's prison, Elara was the one who kept it running. She was the one who brought their meager meals, the one whose soft hands would check the locks. She was proof that the most terrible cruelty can be delivered with a gentle touch and a mother's smile. Together, they formed a perfect, horrifying union, a fortress of piety built around a heart of pure darkness. Now you have to be asking yourself the same question that haunted me. How do you hide two living, breathing people for 40 years? How do you erase them from the world when you live in a small community where everyone knows everything? The answer is both simple and diabolical. You don't hide them with high walls or threats. You hide them with a story. You hide them in plain sight, using pity as a shield. The official story, the one that Elara Morgan would share over the counter at the general store, her voice trembling just so, was that her daughters were tragically unwell. They were born, she'd say, with a weakness of the nerves and a constitution so fragile that the outside world, its sunlight, its sounds, its very air, was a danger to them. This story was a work of twisted genius. Think about it. In an age before modern medicine, when a simple fever could be a death sentence, a tale of chronic, mysterious illness was completely believable. It was the perfect lie. It didn't raise an alarm. It created sympathy. When neighbors would ask after the girls, Samuel would just shake his head, his face a mask of weary resignation, and say, "It's in God's hands now." People stopped asking to see them out of respect for their supposed suffering. The lie transformed the Morgans from captors into caregivers, burdened saints sacrificing their lives for their afflicted children. It painted their cruelty as kindness, their prison as a sanctuary, and with every sympathetic nod and whispered prayer they received from the townspeople, the chains on their daughters grew heavier and the walls of the barn grew taller. Every prison, no matter how clever its story, needs walls. And the infrastructure of the Morgan family's private hell was brutally, terrifyingly simple. It was the barn. From the road, it looked like any other, a large, weathered grey structure sitting 100 yards behind the main house, partially hidden by a thick grove of oak trees. It was a place for storing hay, for sheltering animals from the winter cold. But I want you to look closer with me. Notice how the windows on the side facing the house are boarded over. Notice how the main door is secured not just with a latch, but with a heavy, formidable padlock that seemed far too strong for a simple barn. This building wasn't designed for storage, it was designed for containment. Now, let's step through that door. The air inside is thick, heavy with the smell of old hay, damp earth, and something else. Something sourly human. In the far corner, away from the light, Samuel had built a room within the room. He used thick, rough-hewn planks to create a windowless cell, not much bigger than a closet, with a solid oak door and 3 heavy iron bolts. And inside, bolted directly into the foundational beams of the barn itself, were 2 iron rings and the chains. This was the system, you see, simple, efficient, and unbreakable. Once a day, Elara would carry a bucket of water and a bowl of scraps, which Samuel would slide through a small slot at the bottom of the door. There were no words, no comfort, no touch. It was a silent daily ritual that kept their bodies alive while methodically starving their souls. This wasn't just a barn, it was a carefully constructed machine, built to slowly, day by day, erase 2 human beings from the world. But 40 years is a very long time to keep a perfect secret, isn't it? No prison is completely soundproof. There must have been moments, cracks in the facade when the truth almost slipped out. A cry carried on the wind that sounded a little too human, a thump from inside the barn late at night, maybe a delivery man who thought he saw a pale face in a gap between the boards. And for every one of these moments, Samuel and Elara had a story ready. Their explanations were always calm, always logical, and always designed to make you feel like you were the one who was mistaken. I want you to imagine a neighbor stopping by to borrow some sugar. As he's talking to Samuel on the porch, a faint, mournful wail comes from the barn. The neighbor pauses, a confused look on his face. Samuel doesn't flinch. He just lets out a heavy, sorrowful sigh and shakes his head. "It's one of the girls," he'd say, his voice low and full of pain. "The sickness. Sometimes it brings these terrible fits. The sounds are just awful. We pray on it every night." And just like that, what should have been a clue becomes a confirmation of their tragedy. The explanation didn't just dismiss the oddity, it weaponized it. It made the neighbor feel ashamed for even noticing, for intruding on such a private, painful grief. These quick, believable deflections were the mortar that held the prison together. They turned every potential crack in their story into another layer of sympathy, another reason to simply look away. But a lie as all-encompassing as this, a lie that has to last for decades, is a heavy thing. It's almost impossible for just two people to carry it alone. Sooner or later, you need help. You need someone with authority, someone the town trusts without question, to look everyone in the eye and say, yes, the story is true. For the Morgans, that person was Dr. Alistair Finch. He was the only doctor for 30 miles, a man whose scientific opinion was treated with the same reverence as the preacher's sermons. He was supposed to be a man of healing, of truth, but he was the third architect of this prison. We don't know exactly why he did it. Maybe he was a man who shared Samuel's rigid, fearful view of the world. Or maybe, and I think this is more likely, he was simply a weak man who was called to the farm one day, years ago, saw a situation he couldn't comprehend, and chose the easy path of silence over the difficult path of confrontation. Whatever the reason, his complicity was the final, critical piece of the puzzle. Whenever a new preacher would come to town and ask about the Morgan girls, or when whispers grew too loud, Dr. Finch was the firewall. He would calmly explain, using vague, important-sounding terms like severe nervous affliction, that the girl's condition was delicate. He would praise the Morgans for their unwavering Christian care. He gave their brutal fiction the weight of medical fact, with the town doctor vouching for the lie who would dare to question it. He didn't just enable their crime, he legitimized it. He was the official signature on their cruelty. So we've talked about the prison, the jailers, and their accomplices. But now, we need to talk about the two people who were at the very heart of this darkness, because they weren't always prisoners. They had names. They were Clara and Emily Morgan. Before the barn, before the silence, they were just little girls. Friends who knew them back then remembered Clara as the curious one, the girl with bright, inquisitive eyes who loved chasing fireflies on a summer evening. Emily was the quieter of the two, the dreamer who would hum little tunes to herself while she played. They were children with futures waiting for them, filled with all the small, beautiful things a life is supposed to have. So what was their crime? What did they do to deserve such a fate? Their only crime in their father's eyes was that they began to grow up. It started with Clara. As she blossomed into a young woman, her natural curiosity started to look like rebellion to Samuel. A lingering glance at a boy in town, a question about the world beyond their farm. He saw these not as signs of life, but as symptoms of a spiritual sickness. He believed the world, with all its temptations, was a poison, and his daughter was on the verge of drinking it. So he decided to administer the antidote. His version of love wasn't about letting his daughters grow. It was about stopping them from changing, freezing them in time to protect their souls. Emily was locked away shortly after, not for anything she had done, but for what she might one day do. They were not imprisoned for a sin they had committed. They were imprisoned for the sin of becoming women. For 20 years, the silence held. The story of the sick Morgan girls became a simple, sad fact of life in Copeland County, a piece of local folklore. Their existence was a ghost story everyone had agreed to believe, but the universe has a way of pushing back against secrets. It often uses the eyes of a child who has not yet learned what they are not supposed to see. His name was Thomas Miller, a 10-year-old boy with more curiosity than sense and a talent for wandering where he shouldn't. One late summer afternoon, chasing a runaway kite that had caught a high wind, Thomas found himself on the edge of the Morgan property. The kite had snagged on a high branch of an old oak tree that stood right behind the dreaded barn. While his parents had warned him to stay away, the desire to get his kite back was stronger than his fear. As he worked to free the string, he heard it. A sound that was not the wind nor an animal. It was a low, humming sound, a broken melody, weak and desperately sad. It was coming from inside the barn. Forgetting the kite, he crept closer. There was a single vertical slat in the wall where the wood had warped and split. Heart-pounding, he pressed his eye to the opening. The darkness inside was almost total, but a thin shaft of light from a crack in the roof illuminated a small area. And in that light, he saw it. A human hand, pale as bone, gripping a thick wooden bar. He saw a tangle of dark, matted hair and the brief upward glance of a huge, hollow eye. It wasn't a monster. It was something far more terrifying, a person who looked like a ghost. He stumbled back, a gasp catching in his throat, and when he turned, Samuel Morgan was standing right there, not 10 feet away. He hadn't made a sound. His shadow fell over Thomas, cold and vast. "That's my property you're on, boy," Samuel said, his voice unnervingly calm. "Some things in this world are no fit for little boys to see." Thomas didn't scream. He just ran. The image of that pale hand and that hollow eye burned into his mind forever. A child's mind isn't equipped to process that kind of horror. Thomas Miller ran all the way home, his chest heaving, tears of pure terror streaming down his face. He burst through the door and into the arms of his mother, babbling about what he'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. He tried to describe the pale hand, its fingers unnaturally long and thin, clutching the barn's splintered edge, the sad humming that seemed to vibrate in his bones, and the eyes, those terrible, gleaming eyes in the dark that held both sorrow and something far worse. To his exhausted, practical parents, it sounded like a nightmare brought on by too much sun and an overactive imagination. "A ghost in the barn?" his father said, his voice stern, edged with disbelief. "A monster girl?" Thomas, desperate to be believed, stammered about Mr. Morgan, about the coldness in his voice when he spoke of his daughters, the way his shadow seemed to loom larger than it should. This only made things worse. His father's face hardened, not with concern for his son, but with anger at the disrespect he'd shown. "You were trespassing, Thomas, and now you're telling wicked lies about a good, God-fearing family. Do you have any idea the suffering the Morgans have endured with their sick daughters?" It was a conversation built on a foundation of absolute certainty. The Morgans were victims, their daughters were ill, fragile, and pitiable. Any story that contradicted this was not just a lie, it was a cruelty, an attack on a family already bowed under tragedy. Thomas's mother, usually soft-spoken, added her own admonishment, her voice laced with disappointment. "You've always had such a vivid imagination, Thomas, but this is too far." Thomas was sent to his room without supper, his tears of terror now turning into tears of confusion and betrayal. He had told the truth, the most important truth he had ever known, and he had been punished for it. That night and for many nights after, he dreamed of the eye in the darkness, its gaze piercing through the veil of sleep, whispering secrets he couldn't unhear. But the waking world was now just as frightening. He had seen behind the curtain, glimpsed a truth too vast and terrible for his young mind to hold, and the one person he told had slammed it shut in his face. He learned a powerful and damaging lesson that day. Some truths are so monstrous that the world will punish you for seeing them. The weight of that knowledge settled deep in his chest, a cold, heavy stone. He never spoke of it again. The secret went back into the darkness, but now it lived inside of him too, a silent companion that grew heavier with each passing year, shaping his thoughts, his fears, his silence. It was a burden he carried alone, one that taught him to distrust his own eyes, his own heart, and the world that refused to see. Thomas Miller's father, for all his stern discipline, was not a cruel man. He loved his son, and the boy's persistent nightmares and sudden fearful silence began to weigh on him. He didn't believe the story, not for a second, but for the sake of his own peace of mind he knew he had to do something. So the next time he was in town he stopped by the office of Sheriff Brody. He presented the story sheepishly, framing it as a father's concern, not an accusation. "Sheriff," he began, twisting the brim of his hat, "my boy Thomas, he's got some wild fantasy stuck in his head about the Morgan place. Says he saw something in the barn. I know it's nonsense, but it spooked him, something awful. I just thought I should mention it, to be a good citizen." Sheriff Brody, a man who preferred paperwork to problems, listened with a patient sigh. He knew the Morgans well. He saw Samuel at church every Sunday. An official investigation was the last thing he wanted. But a citizen had made a report, however flimsy, so he had to be seen to do his duty. He rode out to the Morgan farm that afternoon. It wasn't an inquiry, it was a social call. He found Samuel on the porch, repairing a harness. He explained the situation in the most apologetic way possible. Samuel Morgan's performance was masterful. He didn't get angry, he simply looked wounded, his face a mask of profound sorrow. "Sheriff," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "my Elara and I have devoted our lives to caring for our afflicted girls. Their suffering is our suffering. To think that people, Even children are telling monster stories about them. It's a heavy burden to bear. He gestured to the barn. You are welcome to look inside, of course. There's nothing but tools and hay. But the noise might upset my daughters. Their nerves are so fragile. In that moment, the sheriff felt a wave of shame. He was intruding on a good man's private grief. No, Samuel, that won't be necessary, he said quickly. I'm sorry to have bothered you. He tipped his hat and rode away. The official inquiry was over. The lie was now officially endorsed by the law. While the world outside debated the fantasies of a little boy, inside the barn, time moved to a different rhythm, sluggish and oppressive, as if the air itself had thickened with despair. For Clara and Emily Morgan, the world had shrunk to the size of their cell, a cramped, rotting space that reeked of mildew and sorrow. The memories of sunshine, of open fields and other faces had long ago faded into something unreal, like half-forgotten dreams pieced together from fragments of a life they could no longer claim. They were the living proof of the crime, their own bodies the testament to their long suffering, each scar and hollow a chapter in a story no one dared read. Let's be clear, the girls who had been dragged into that barn decades ago no longer truly existed. In their place were two pale, wraith-like figures, their bodies thin and stooped, their muscles withered from a lifetime of disuse, their bones brittle from years without nourishment or freedom. Their skin, untouched by the sun for decades, was a translucent, sickly white, stretched taut over veins that pulsed faintly beneath. Their hair, never cut, was a tangled, matted mess that fell to their waists, streaked with grey despite their youth, as if time had aged them prematurely. Their eyes, accustomed only to the gloom, were huge and dark, pupils dilated to drink in the scant light, and would flinch from even the faintest ray that pierced their prison, as if the sun itself were an enemy. They were spectres, haunted by the memory of life, their forms barely human, their existence a mockery of what they once were. Yet, in the suffocating darkness, a sliver of their humanity stubbornly survived, clinging to them like moss to a forgotten stone. They had created their own silent world, a shared existence in the shadows, built from the ruins of their stolen lives. They communicated through small, almost imperceptible gestures, a touch of the hand, a shared glance, a fleeting moment of connection that defied their isolation. Sometimes one of them, no one knows which, would hum. It was the same broken, mournful tune that Thomas Miller had heard, a melody from a childhood they could no longer properly remember, its notes trembling with a grief too deep for words. It was the ghost of a song, sung by the ghosts of two women, a fragile thread tying them to a world that had abandoned them. They were no longer just victims of a crime. Their very existence had been altered, reshaped by the relentless cruelty of their confinement. They were living artifacts of their parents' cruelty, their stunted bodies and broken minds the most powerful evidence of a crime no one had the courage to see, a truth buried in the darkness they were forced to call home. What happened to Clara and Emily in that barn was not simple, brutish neglect. I want you to understand that, to see the chilling intelligence behind it. Samuel Morgan's cruelty was not chaotic, it was a system. It was a cold, calculated and deeply patient methodology designed not just to imprison his daughters' bodies, but to conquer their souls. This was his terrible, twisted science. The first tool was sensory deprivation. The constant darkness wasn't just a feature of the barn, it was a weapon. It erased the rhythm of day and night, severing their connection to the natural world and making them utterly dependent on his schedule. It was a way to make their world disappear. The second tool was nutritional control. The meager bowl of scraps slid through the slot each day was calibrated to provide just enough sustenance to prevent death, but not enough to foster strength. He was keeping them in a state of perpetual weakness, ensuring their bodies could never harbor the energy for a rebellious thought or an escape attempt. The third and most powerful tool was psychological warfare, disguised as religious salvation. Samuel would often stand outside their cell door and read to them from the Bible, but he didn't read passages of love or comfort. He read of hellfire, of damnation, of the wickedness of the world outside. He preached to them that their prison was a holy ark, built to save them from the fires of temptation that consumed everyone else. He was trying to convince them that their chains were an act of love, that their suffering was a form of purity. The ultimate goal of his methodology was to break their will so completely that they would become grateful for their captivity. He didn't just want to lock the door, he wanted to destroy the very idea of a world beyond it. Secrets, like bodies, don't stay buried forever. 20 years passed, the story of the Morgan girls faded even further, and young Thomas Miller grew into a man. But the boy who ran from the barn that day never truly escaped it. The memory of the pale face and his parents' disbelief had shaped him, leaving him with a quiet, obsessive intensity and a deep distrust of comfortable truths. He had left Copeland County the moment he was old enough, taking a job as a records clerk in a city far away, surrounding himself with the black and white certainty of facts and figures. But the unanswered question of his childhood haunted his nights and hollowed out his days. He was a man with a splinter in his soul. The thing that finally brought him back was, as it often is, a death. His father passed away, and Thomas returned home to a town that had barely changed to settle the small estate. He was in his early 30s now, a stranger to the people he grew up with, seen as the quiet, troubled Miller boy who had never quite fit in. He was no shining knight. He was a flawed, haunted man, driven by a need that was as much about his own salvation as it was about justice. As he stood on his family's property, looking across the familiar fields toward the distant grey shape of the Morgan barn, the memory of that day came rushing back not as a hazy nightmare, but as a vivid, undeniable reality. He wasn't a scared child anymore, and in that moment, he made a decision. He would not leave until he knew the truth. This wasn't just about two unknown women anymore. This was about reclaiming his own life from the shadow of that barn. Thomas Miller knew he couldn't just march up to the sheriff's office and demand an investigation. That path had been tried and had failed spectacularly. The town's wall of silence, built over 40 years, was too high to climb. He had to tunnel underneath it. He used his father's funeral as his cover, his reason for being there. It allowed him to speak to the townspeople not as an accuser, but as a grieving son returning home. He was a master of listening, of asking the questions that didn't sound like questions. At the small gathering after the service, he talked to one of the older church ladies. "It's been so long," he'd say. "I see the Morgan place is still standing. Such a tragedy, what they've gone through. I can't imagine." Then he would just listen, watching her eyes, noting the slight hesitation before she gave the standard, rehearsed reply about their piety. He spent a week like this, moving through the town, gathering the threads of the official story. His most crucial step was a visit to the now elderly Dr. Finch. He made an appointment under the pretense of a persistent cough. In the dusty office, surrounded by old medical books, he guided the conversation back in time. "You know, doctor," he said casually, "as a boy, I was so frightened by the stories of the Morgan girl's sickness. It must have been a terrible thing to treat." He watched the old doctor carefully, seeing the flicker of anxiety in his eyes, the way he fidgeted with a pen. Dr. Finch gave him the same tired, vague answers about a nervous condition, but his unease was palpable. Thomas knew he was close to a nerve. His final tactic was the most dangerous. Using his childhood knowledge of the woods, he began a quiet surveillance of the Morgan farm, watching from a hidden spot on a ridge. For days he just observed the cold, unyielding routine. Samuel's solitary trip to the barn once a day. The utter lack of any other sign of life. He was mapping the infrastructure of the crime, looking for a single weakness, a moment when the 40-year-old system might finally make a mistake. "We need to pause here for a moment. Just you and me. We've walked together through 40 years of darkness. We've felt the suffocating silence of Copeland County, and we've seen the quiet, determined obsession in Thomas Miller's eyes. We have pieced together the anatomy of a perfect crime, a crime hidden by piety and fear. But I have to ask you right now, can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns from a cold, quiet mystery into something else entirely. The careful investigation is over. The surveillance is done. What Thomas is about to do will take a sledgehammer to that wall of silence, and the sound is going to be deafening. The chilling part isn't the crime anymore, it's the unmasking of it. So take a deep breath. What happens from this point forward is not just disturbing, it's unforgettable, and we are going to see it through to the end together. The moment Thomas had been waiting for, the single crack in the fortress of routine, arrived with the sound of a distant church bell. It was Sunday morning. From his vantage point in the woods, he watched Samuel and Elara Morgan emerge from their house. Dressed in black, their Bibles in hand, they climbed into their buggy and set off down the dirt road toward town, leaving the farm in a state of profound and deceptive silence. Thomas knew this was it. He had maybe 2 hours, a sliver of time to uncover a 40-year-old truth. His heart hammered against his ribs as he moved from the cover of the trees, every snap of a twig under his boots sounding like a gunshot in the still air. He reached the enormous weathered barn door, the heavy padlock looking like a seal on a tomb. He didn't have a key, but he had a crowbar he'd taken from his father's old shed. The sound of the iron lock groaning and then snapping open was sickeningly loud. He pulled the heavy door just wide enough to slip inside and was met with a wall of thick, foul air. A stench of animal waste, rotting hay, and an underlying sour smell of human misery that he recognized with a jolt from his childhood memory. He pulled out a small lantern, his shaking hands struggling to strike the match. The small flame flickered to life, pushing back the oppressive darkness. And there it was. In the far corner, exactly as he remembered, was the cell. A room within a room, its thick plank door secured with 3 heavy iron bolts. A faint, terrified rustling came from within. He knew he was standing at the door to hell. With immense effort, he slid back the top bolt. The sound of screeching metal echoed through the barn. He pulled the door open, raised the lantern, and the light fell upon the damning evidence. They were huddled together in the corner, 2 skeletal figures in rags, their white skin stretched tight over their bones. They raised their arms to shield their huge dark eyes from the light, a light they hadn't seen in decades. They didn't scream, they just stared, frozen in a state of pure animal terror. One of them began to hum, that same broken, haunting melody. The proof wasn't a clue, it was a nightmare made real. For a long second, Thomas was paralyzed, his mind struggling to process the absolute horror in front of him. His first instinct, the human instinct, was to rush in, to help them. But one look at their terrified skeletal faces told him the truth. He couldn't. They were like creatures from another world, and his presence was just another terror to them. He knew then that his mission was not to be their rescuer, but their witness. He had to get this story back to the world. He started backing away, his hands trembling as he tried to pull the heavy barn door closed without a sound. It was then that he heard it, the rhythmic beat of horse hooves, approaching the farm far too quickly. Through a crack in the wall, he saw the Morgans' buggy, returning at a near gallop. They had forgotten their Bible on the porch. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He was trapped. He scrambled into the deepest, darkest corner of the barn, diving behind a massive stack of old musty hay bales and extinguishing his lantern. The barn was plunged back into darkness, but now it was a shared darkness. A moment later, the buggy stopped. Thomas heard Samuel's heavy boots on the gravel. There was a pause. He had seen the broken lock. The barn door was thrown open with a deafening groan, silhouetting Samuel's huge frame against the bright morning sun. "I know you're in here," Samuel's voice echoed, not with a shout, but with a low, chilling growl that was far more frightening. "You have trespassed on holy ground." Thomas held his breath, praying the shadows would hide him. He heard Samuel walk to the cell, heard his sharp intake of breath as he saw the disturbed bolts. Then, the sound of metal scraping against wood. Samuel had armed himself with a pitchfork. He began stalking the barn, plunging the sharp tines deep into the haystacks. "The Lord sees all trespassers," he hissed. One of the pitchfork's tired upturn ness pierced the bale just inches from Thomas's head. He knew he was about to die. In a final desperate act, as Samuel turned his back, Thomas bolted. He burst from the hay and sprinted for the light. A roar of pure fury erupted from Samuel as he gave chase. Thomas scrambled out into the blinding sun, stumbling through the dirt, not daring to look back, the sound of Samuel's pounding footsteps terrifyingly close behind. He reached the tree line, his lungs burning, and plunged into the safety of the woods, running until he could no longer hear anything but the frantic beat of his own heart. Thomas didn't stop running when he reached the safety of the woods. He crashed through the undergrowth, fueled by a primal terror and a burning righteous fury, not stopping until he stumbled out onto the main road leading back to town. He must have been a terrifying sight to the good people of Copeland County who were just leaving their Sunday service. He was covered in dirt and hay, with a long, bloody scratch down one side of his face, his clothes torn, his eyes wild. He ignored their shocked stares, his mind fixed on a single destination, the sheriff's office. He burst through the door without knocking, finding Sheriff Brody sitting at his desk, a half-eaten sandwich in his hand. The sheriff looked up, annoyed. "What in God's name, Thomas?" he started. But Thomas cut him off, his words spilling out in a desperate, ragged torrent. "He's got them in the barn, Sheriff, in a cell. Clara and Emily. I saw them. They're alive, but oh God, they're like skeletons." He leaned on the desk, gasping for breath, the terror of the last hour giving his testimony a terrifying weight. "Samuel came back. He saw the broken lock. He tried to kill me. He chased me with a pitchfork." The sheriff's face was a mask of disbelief and frustration. He was about to dismiss it all as another one of the troubled Miller Boys episodes, to tell him to calm down and go home. But Thomas wasn't a child anymore. He looked the sheriff dead in the eye, his voice dropping with a sudden, chilling certainty. "You think I'm lying? Go out there right now. The big padlock on the main barn door is lying on the ground, broken in two. I broke it. Go and see it for yourself before he can hide the evidence. Go and see them." In that moment, the sheriff saw not a madman but a horrified and credible witness. He saw the truth of the last 20 years rushing toward him like a freight train. The risk of awing Thomas was now infinitely greater than the discomfort of believing him. The town's carefully constructed lie had just become an explosive liability, and he was holding the match. His face went pale. "Stay here, Thomas," he said, his voice heavy with a dread he could no longer deny. "Don't you move. I'm getting my deputy." There were no sirens, no grand display of force. The arrival of the law at the Morgan farm was a quiet, grim affair that stood in stark contrast to the peaceful Sunday afternoon. Sheriff Brody, his young deputy, and a pale-faced Dr. Finch, who had been summoned from his home and told only that his presence was required, rode up the long dirt driveway. Samuel Morgan was waiting for them on the porch, his piety replaced by a cold, defiant fury. "Sheriff," he said, his voice low and hard, "this is a house of God. You have no business here." Sheriff Brody, his face set like stone, didn't hesitate. "I have a credible report of false imprisonment and attempted murder, Samuel. Now you can either stand aside or my deputy will move you." For a moment it seemed Samuel might resist, but something in the sheriff's eyes, a complete absence of the deference he was used to, made him step back. The lawmen left him on the porch and walked with heavy steps toward the barn. They found the broken padlock lying in the dirt, just as Thomas had said. The sheriff pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the gloom, his deputy right behind him. The stench hit them like a physical blow, and both men flinched. Following the ghost of Thomas's frantic directions, the sheriff made his way to the back corner and stood before the crude plank door. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the heavy iron bolts. He slid them back, the screech of the metal echoing the sound of a 40-year-old lie being torn apart. He pulled the door open, raised his lantern, and the chamber of horrors was revealed. The reality was 1,000 times worse than Thomas's words. Cowering in the corner were two creatures that were barely recognizable as human, skeletally thin, wrapped in filthy rags, their long matted hair covering their faces. A chain ran from an iron ring on the wall to a rusted cuff on one of the women's ankles. As the light hit them, they let out a series of low, terrified whimpers, shielding their massive, haunted eyes. The deputy took a stumbling step back, whispering, "My God!" The sheriff just stood there, speechless, his lantern shaking in his hand. The secret was out, and it was more monstrous than anyone could have ever imagined. When a monster is caught, we expect a moment of confession, of shame, a crack in the facade that reveals a flicker of remorse. But when Sheriff Brody emerged from the barn, his face a grim sheet of white, and placed Samuel Morgan under arrest, there was no such moment. The mask of the pious, grieving father didn't just slip, it was violently torn away, revealing something far more terrifying beneath. Samuel didn't weep or beg for forgiveness. He erupted in a volcano of self-righteous fury. "You fools!" he roared, his voice booming across the pristine farmyard as the deputy struggled to restrain him. "You are agents of the devil. That barn was a sanctuary. I built them an ark to save them from the filth of this world, the sin that you wallow in every day. I was protecting their immortal souls." In his own mind, he wasn't a jailer. He was a savior. He wasn't a villain. He was a martyr being persecuted by a world that didn't understand his holy work. He saw the horror on the faces of his neighbors who had begun to gather at the end of the driveway, and he mistook it for ignorance. But the second, and perhaps more chilling, unmasking was yet to come. Elara Morgan walked out of the house. The crowd fell silent, expecting to see a broken woman, a victim finally freed from her tyrannical husband. Instead, she stood on the porch, her back straight, her face a placid mask of unwavering conviction. She looked at the sheriff, at her raging husband, and then at the horrified townspeople. "He is a man of God," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the chaos. "We did only what was necessary to keep our children pure." There was no crack in her facade. There was only the cold, hard certainty of a true believer. In that moment, everyone understood. This was not the work of one tyrannical man and his frightened wife. This was a partnership, a holy mission for two. And, as they were led away, they showed no guilt, only contempt for the world that had dared to interfere with their terrible, twisted form of salvation. When a darkness this profound is uncovered, the first thing we do is search for its boundaries. To try and understand the scope of the evil, we look for a wider conspiracy, a secret organization. The template for these stories tells us to look for an international network, but the horror of the Morgan family wasn't that grand or complex. The network that enabled this crime wasn't a shadowy cabal. It was something far more ordinary and far more chilling. It was the community itself. The network wasn't one of shared guilt, but of shared silence. Think of it like a web. At its dark heart were Samuel and Elara Morgan. The first and most critical ring of the web was Dr. Alistair Finch, the man of science who chose to endorse a monstrous lie, giving it the unbreakable shield of medical authority. He was the active, knowing collaborator. The next ring was the institution of the law, personified by Sheriff Brody. He wasn't a villain, but his desire for a quiet life, his deference to a man of Samuel's standing, and his willingness to accept a comfortable story over a disturbing truth made him a powerful, if unwitting, guardian of the secret. But the final, largest ring of this web was the town itself. It was made up of every neighbor who told themselves it wasn't their place to interfere. Every churchgoer who heard Samuel's passionate sermons and saw only piety, not fanaticism. Every person who accepted the story of the sick girls did so because the alternative was too horrifying to contemplate. They didn't conspire to commit a crime. They conspired to remain ignorant. This wasn't a network of criminals. It was a network of denial. A web of willful blindness woven from threads of good manners, misplaced respect, and a collective, unspoken agreement that the most comfortable truth is always the best one. The scope of the crime wasn't limited to a single barn. It encompassed an entire town. So we arrive at the most difficult question of all. Why? Why did an entire community of what we would call good, decent people participate in this societal conspiracy of silence? To understand this, we have to understand that the conspiracy wasn't an active, whispered plot. It was a passive one, a conspiracy of belief. And the reasons for it are as human as they are horrifying. First, there was the immense power of authority in a world like that of the 1870s. The family was a sacred kingdom, and the father was its absolute king. To question what Samuel Morgan did with his own daughters, on his own property, was to question the very bedrock of their social order. It was an act of profound rebellion, and the social cost of that rebellion, of being labeled a gossip, a troublemaker, an enemy of a man of God, was immense. Second, there is the simple, powerful comfort of a believable lie. The story of the poor, sick Morgan girls was a tragedy, but it was a familiar, understandable tragedy. It fit neatly into their worldview of hardship, faith, and suffering. The truth, however, was a chaotic psychological monster. It suggested that the man they shared a pew with on Sunday was capable of a darkness they couldn't comprehend. The lie, however sad, kept their world stable. The truth would have shattered it. And before we judge them too harshly from the comfort of our own time, we need to look in the mirror. How often do we choose the path of least resistance? We hear a shout from a neighbor's house and decide it's just a family argument. We see signs of trouble in someone's life and hesitate, telling ourselves it's not our place to interfere, that we don't want to get involved. The silence of Copeland County wasn't born from a single evil decision. It was woven from hundreds of small individual choices to prioritize comfort over concern, to respect privacy over protecting the vulnerable. It's a chilling reminder that the deadliest prisons aren't always built with stone and iron, but with the quiet collective decision to look away. Once the door to that barn was opened, the story of the Morgan family was no longer a secret whispered in the shadows. It was a firestorm of public horror and fascination. The legal process was swift. Samuel and Elara Morgan stood trial, and for weeks the courtroom listened to the grim testimony of the sheriff, the doctors, and the shame-faced townspeople. But the most damning evidence was the very presence of their daughters. Throughout the proceedings, the Morgans showed no remorse. They sat stone-faced, clinging to their twisted righteousness like a holy text. In their final statements, they didn't ask for mercy but condemned the court for interfering with God's will. They were found guilty and sentenced to life in the state penitentiary, where they lived out the remainder of their days in shared, unrepentant silence. Dr. Finch, the quiet collaborator, was spared prison, but not punishment. His complicity, exposed in the trial, destroyed him. Stripped of his medical license and branded a pariah in the town that once revered him, he sold his practice and vanished, his name forever bound to the crime he helped conceal. And the hero, Thomas Miller, he was publicly vindicated. The truth he had carried as a lonely, terrifying burden, now acknowledged by the world. But there was no triumph in it. He had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. Unable to remain in a town so deeply scarred by the truth he had unearthed, he left Copeland County for a second and final time, a man forever haunted by the ghosts he had set free. But the most tragic fate was reserved for the victims. Clara and Emily were taken to a sanatorium, a place of quiet gardens and gentle care. Their bodies were healed, but their minds and souls remained captive. They never truly returned to the world. Terrified of open spaces and the sound of unfamiliar voices, they lived out their lives in the safety of the institution, forever bound to each other, speaking a private, whispered language that no one else could understand. They had been rescued, but they could never truly be saved. A story like this doesn't just end when the guilty are imprisoned and the victims are rescued. It leaves behind a deep and permanent scar. For Copeland County, the Morgan farm became a cursed place. The house and barn were left to rot, slowly collapsing under the weight of seasons and memory, a crumbling monument to the town's collective shame. For generations, children would whisper ghost stories about the place, and the name Morgan became synonymous with a darkness they could never fully wash away. The town lost its innocence. It was forced to accept that the most monstrous things can happen not in some faraway land, but right here, behind a neighbor's friendly wave. But the true legacy of this story isn't just a local ghost story. It's a powerful and deeply unsettling moral lesson for all of us. It's a warning about the terrifying danger of absolute certainty. Samuel Morgan's crime was born from a faith so rigid and so arrogant that it placed its own dogma above the fundamental compassion of a father for his children. He wasn't a monster who hated his daughters. He was a monster who believed his twisted love gave him the right to destroy them in order to save them. This story holds a mirror up to our own lives and our own communities. It forces us to question the nature of silence, to ask ourselves where the line is between respecting a neighbor's privacy and enabling a hidden horror. The legacy of Clara and Emily Morgan, two women who had their voices stolen from them, is a single, piercing question that echoes out from their 40 years of darkness. When you are faced with an uncomfortable truth, when you suspect a terrible secret is being kept behind a closed door, will you have the courage to be the one who speaks? Will you be the witness? And so we leave the story of the Morgan family behind, but its questions will follow us. Could something like this happen today, in our own towns, on our own streets, behind a perfectly normal front door? The terrifying truth is that the same forces of silence and denial that allowed this to happen still exist in our world. And it leaves us with one final personal question. If you saw a crack in a neighbor's perfect facade, if you noticed a small, unsettling detail that no one else seemed to see, would you have the courage to look closer, or would you choose to look away? The memory of Clara and Emily Morgan is a powerful reminder of why we must choose to see. If you believe their story is a lesson that needs to be remembered, please share this video and comment below with your thoughts. Subscribe to Shadow Stories and join our community as we continue to shine a light into the darkest corners of history, together. Join us next time as we journey to a remote, windswept island to uncover the harrowing mystery of the Elara Morgan lighthouse, where 3 keepers vanished into thin air, leaving behind a meal untouched on the table and a logbook filled with entries of a strange and terrible storm that never was.